Now, the European Union has just rolled out its 18th sanctions package against Russia, and it's the toughest yet, from slashing the oil price cap to blacklisting over 100 shadow fleet tankers. The EU says it's done with loopholes and circumvention. But here's where it gets complicated. India finds itself in the crosshairs again. Yes, in particular, this 18th round of European sanctions on Russian oil affects one of the country's largest oil refineries in Vadinar in Gujarat, which counts Russian energy giant Rosneft as its majority stakeholder. This round of sanctions also brings action against the Indian registry of ships, which is the fourth largest such registry in the world and also operates a majority of oil tankers currently moving Russian crude oil. So the big question then is the West weaponizing or, of course, serious about these sanctions? And what will, of course, be the ramifications in India of these latest measures? In fact, some breaking news coming in on this story. Russian exports of mineral fertilizers to India has increased 4 times over the last year. That's what Russian President Vladimir Putin has revealed. The request for increased exports comes directly from the Indian leadership, as revealed in a meeting between Putin and the Russian Association of Fertilizer Producers, President Andrei Guriev.
Наша отрасль смогла переориентироваться на другие рынки. Я хочу, например, сказать, что в Индии мы выросли в 4 раза поставки. В Африке. То есть
Joining us live is Ambassador Suresh Goyal, a former diplomat. In fact, Ambassador Goyal, before we get to the main, of course, discussion, what do you make of this latest revelation that has come in? Direct exports, of course, increasing from Russia of mineral fertilizers to India. This has increased over 4 times in the last year alone. Ambassador Goyal?
Yes. Sorry, Uday. The connection was not very good.
Okay.
And I lost out on a bit of what you said.
Ambassador Goyal, I was trying to ask you about this latest revelation that has been made by the Russian leadership that exports of mineral fertilizers to India has increased over 4 times in the last year alone. This news, of course, coming in even as these new sanctions have been announced.
Yes. I think, Uday, if you look at the whole totality of what we get from Russia, the India-Russia trade, including fertilizers and the oil coming into the Vadinar refinery, if you look at the whole totality, and if you look at the totality of what Russia does in Europe, in terms of the oil supplies, the gas supplies, and the energy trade, energy metrics that we now have at the moment, if you look at the whole thing, I find that using sanctions basically to put pressure on one country or the other, it has not worked in the past, particularly when they relate to trade, and it is not going to work really now, because any kind of a trade sanction affects not only just the supplier, but it impacts on the entire supply chain as we go down the line. For example, if you look at the fertilizers you mentioned, the whole agricultural, the whole food security of India would depend upon the fertilizer supply chain we have got at the moment. Till we are able to actually diversify it, it is not going to be possible to change it. Oil, if you look at the Vadinar refinery, the Vadinar refinery capacity constitutes something about 5 to 10% of the total refining capacity of India. It's not going to work really. And if you look at Europe, Kazakhstan pipelines from Kazakhstan oil coming to Europe from the Russian pipelines, how are they going to work on all that? I think it's essentially a response to what the US is doing. US-Europe trade regime, pressure on European Union from the USA, and I don't think it's going to really be there for too long before people begin to ignore. Look at Iran. They have been able to survive all this. So I will not be too bothered about this kind of a pressure really. Uday.
Dr. Sharad Kohli, let me quickly draw you in at that point as well, Dr. Kohli, because the fact, of course, is that these are new measures that have been announced by the EU. They do affect India directly in a couple of ways, of course, as I outlined earlier. How concerned should we be at these sanctions?
Well, good evening, Uday. Good evening to my fellow panelists and Newsx viewers. This is hypocrisy at its best, if you ask me honestly. $200 billion, 200 billion euros, I'm sorry, have been paid by the European countries, or shall I say European Union, to Russia ever since 2022, this war started between Russia and Ukraine. Spain, Italy, Belgium, they have been recklessly importing energy from Russia. So this is hypocrisy. You can do it yourself, but you want other countries to be put under sanction. This is a classic case of, in inverted commas, this is not sanction. This is hypocrisy. This is double standards, Uday. Absolute categorical. And in the recent meeting, the 18th meeting we are referring to, Hungary and Slovakia have refused to accept these sanctions because these countries, they cannot survive without. They're going to die. There is winters around the corner in another few months. They are going to die. They will not have oil to heat up. These countries face temperatures as low as -20, -25. If they don't get energy from Russia, they are going to collapse. Their people are going to die. From day one, several of European Union countries had refused to accept these sanctions. They may be doing it under the carpet. They may not be doing it openly. But the fact of the matter is there is evidence on record that 200 billion euros of payment have been made to Russia ever after the war started and the so-called sanctions were imposed. So I think people who live in glass houses should not throw stones at others. You are doing something which you want the other person not to do. I think this should be refuted completely. As far as India is concerned, I don't think India is going to be impacted. India prefers to keep its relation on one-on-one basis. We don't believe in sanctions. This is incorrect diplomacy. This is absolutely violative of international, trading laws, and I completely refute it and I criticize it from the bottom of my heart today.
Let me draw you in here at this point because these are, of course, measures that have been announced now by the EU. Do you believe this is convenient posturing by them?
Look, I'd like to basically agree with what Sharath and Ambassador were saying. The reality of the situation is that several of the European countries, notably Germany, for example, they are suffering much lower growth because of their own sanctions on Russia and on imports from Russia. They are facing a slowdown in growth, and frankly, Chancellor Merz came to power on the back of a slowing economy, and he has basically accepted all the policies that have led to a slowing economy. So I don't know what's going to happen the next time around. My feeling is that the extremes, the extreme right and the extreme left, will become much more powerful at the expense of the centrist parties, both conservative and social democrat. So I want to point out that I think it's absolute hypocrisy, and I think India is a big country. We cannot be bullied, and certainly, they can argue that it's because it's a Russian-owned refinery. It's a Russian-controlled refinery, but it's on Indian territory. It's subject to Indian laws and Indian sovereignty. So supposing you have, for example, European companies here, and they're also subjected to Indian sovereignty. So you can't say that this is, that this is independent of Indian law and Indian sovereignty. So quite frankly, I agree. It is complete hypocrisy. In my view, I would view it as an act that will certainly affect the public perceptions about the European Union as a friend of India, and especially in a situation where the Indo-Pacific is facing challenges, the European Union realizes the importance of India. So I think the sooner these sanctions are withdrawn, the better. And as for the fertilizer, as for shipping, well, I think India is coming up as a major shipping country. And I think some European countries are not very happy with that. Look, this is not the age of colonialism. This is not the age when European countries were riding piggyback on their colonies and doing very well at the expense of their colonies. India stopped being a colony in 1947. Europe had better get out of this colonial mindset and try to impose its own values on the rest of others. I mean, as Jaishankar put it very correctly, you feel any problem of Europe is a world problem, but any of the rest of the world's problems are not your problems. That is rank hypocrisy. That is not only double standard, it is very frankly an action that is very unfriendly and that is very unhelpful to Europe from the point of view of international security. This will be of great, joy. This will bring great joy to the Chinese. And there are Chinese networks active throughout Europe, and they would have been cranking up this machine against Russia, also, by the way, and against India. And they'd be delighted at the success as demonstrated by this particular policy. It's a self-defeating policy. It's a policy where you're basically trying to see that the Indo-Pacific comes under Chinese control, and I think this is something that needs to be pointed out to the European public. And the government of India, I'm sure, is doing quiet diplomacy on this with the European Union, and I think I agree with the other discussions. I think this sanction should be removed from India, and the sooner the better. India is a friend, India is a partner, India is not an enemy, has never been an enemy. So please don't try and impose sanctions because some people in Europe still have a colonial mentality and they believe that the former colonies are not really former in any real sense of the term, only in a formal sense of the term, and they should obey their European masters. Sorry, we have no master except the Indian voter, and that there is no authority in India except the elected authorities in the center and the states and lower down. So I think, Uday, this is an extremely unfortunate action, and I think the European Union needs to reevaluate it and remove it, and the sooner the better. Thank you.
Mithali Nikore, let me draw you in here, Mithali. Do you believe, pressure tactics, selective posturing, deliberate design to it? Or do you believe this is really cutting across the board?
Thanks, Uday, for bringing me into the conversation. I'd like to start with some numbers because completely agree with all my fellow panelists here. If you look at EU imports of Russian oil in 2024, they totaled about 21.9 billion euros. And EU's aid to Ukraine in the same year was 18.7 billion euros. So the amount that the EU has spent on purchasing Russian oil has actually exceeded the aid that the EU has passed on to Ukraine. Though it professes to support Ukraine in this war. And these numbers come from a European think tank, the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. So it's on their website. And at the end of the day, these numbers tell you the full story that, you know, on one hand, while you had energy needs as a continent, as a grouping, you went ahead and for several years you went and purchased, Russian oil because you said, we can't substitute away. We can't move away from Russian oil. But, here you are sanctioning an emerging economy. What is our per capita income? India's per capita income stands at approximately $2,100, $2,200 per annum. And what is the per capita income of the US? What is the per capita income of the EU? The US per capita income is $85,000 per year. If these countries haven't been able to invest and set up systems, to move to clean energy, to move to a situation where they are not dependent on Russian oil, then how do they expect an emerging economy which is already grappling with its own challenges, which is already grappling with its own priorities? And why are we an emerging economy? Like Professor Narapat very rightly said, it's because of colonization. It's because of a history of oppression which comes from the United Kingdom, which comes from the EU, which comes from the US in many ways. And today we are seeing a replay of this economic colonization of the US and other Western nations sort of setting these rules of the game for emerging economies and saying, We are the ones with the financial capital, so you have to still fall in line with us. This is a way of asserting their economic dominance, of asserting, that they are the ones who will set the rules of the game. So I think at this point in time for India, it becomes really essential to firstly make it very clear that we are not going to be playing by rules that are set by other countries. We have our own domestic economy which is extremely strong. We are not an export dependent economy. We are a very domestic consumption and investment driven economy. So we have to look inwards a little bit and assert our economic strength. And secondly, we have to start talking to a wider group of countries, and we have to show that leadership within the global south. Because today, if they have said this about India, tomorrow it can be said about any of the other African countries also, where there's a large Russian oil dependence. It could be said about Latin American countries, and India has to emerge as a leader of the global south. The actions that we take today and the way in which we respond today is actually going to determine how the EU and the US might deal with, some of the other emerging economies. And it becomes really critical for India to assert that, emerging economies around the world cannot be dominated and will have to, be taken as allies, not pushed into a corner, but rather be brought on as allies in, a coalition in a multipolar world. It's also critical to say that our economic strength and our economic growth is something which I'm in Washington right now, and I've actually been speaking to a lot of people, and everybody is astounded by the India story, that India's grown so fast. How did this happen? And at the end of the day, we have to make it clear to them that India's growth is good for the global growth. India's growth is good for America's growth. Working together with the US, working together with the EU will bring further growth for the entire world. This narrative is something that, all our embassies, all our consulates really have to push forward as well. Back to you there.
Is it pretty unlikely, though, that anything will change as far as our policy is concerned, despite this fresh move, Professor Narapat?
The fact of the matter is, the last person who will admit to hypocrisy is the hypocrite. The last person, absolutely. Now, my point is very simple. These sanctions on India, as Mitali pointed out, a country which is in a very different league from the European countries where it comes to per capita income. We are talking of human beings, Uday. We are talking of human suffering. We are talking of deficiencies in the human quality of life, and we are talking of other deficiencies suffered by human beings. Where is this great talk about human rights, which are by some European countries, when they're taking actions that are designed to make the lives of these already very poor human beings much worse, and frankly, drive some of them into a more extreme situation, and some of them into a situation which is too terrible to describe. I think it's a human rights crime. It's a violation of human rights. And I think the European Union needs to be called out before the international community for its gross violation of basic human rights, the basic human right to a dignified existence, to a sufficient diet, to sufficient health care, to sufficient housing, to sufficient work, and which can only be coming from a prosperous economy. And as Mitali correctly said, somehow we are managing that, but still there are a lot of people who are in need of help. And what the European Union has just done is frankly a human rights violation in the worst sense of the term. And I think they need to be called out as frankly as human rights violators, and they should be subjected to the same penalties that they so effortlessly prescribe for others whom sometimes correctly, some often incorrectly, they label as human rights violators. This is a gross violation of human rights and a gross violation of the freedom of the most underprivileged sections of society, and the human rights of these people are being violated by this particular set of actions by the European Union. And I think the European Union needs to be called out for this vicious attack on the human rights of the most underprivileged people in India, and frankly, some of the most underprivileged people anywhere in the world. I think this is where I feel the human rights conscience of the world, such as it is, needs to wake up and be aware of what the European Union is doing with the basic human rights of a country that is on trying to develop and trying to help the poorest of the poor. And the European Union is trying to prevent that. And as correctly been said, where has the European Union gone in green energy is concerned? Where is the money that is supposed to come from the European Union to countries like India? It's not there. A lot of talk is there. A lot of what I may say is hot air is there, but there's no money. There's nothing on the table. All they want is more and more money, more and more and more concessions. And frankly, this shows the colonial mentality is unfortunately alive and kicking at the poorer countries in some of the European minds. And the sooner our European friends, and I repeat the word, our European friends, get rid of this kind of colonial mentality, the better for them. It's a new world. And it has got to be a new Europe, and it's a new India. So please don't play the game of geopolitical adversaries and do things that the Indian people will not like. And the Indian people elect their governments, and so they'll elect a government that does not like it. So please do not do that. Please support the democracies like India, and please do not trample on basic human rights in the way these policies of yours have, Uday.
In fact, quickly, take that to Ambassador Goyal as well. Ambassador Goyal, as far as, of course, these measures are concerned, is it likely that the US could also come up with similar sanctions based on what EU has done as well?
Uday, I'm happy that you mentioned US. Frankly speaking, this is very bad geopolitics that I see playing. Number one, and I'm going to be very brief because it is coming to the end of the debate. Very briefly, number one, I do think that European Union has put in these sanctions in response to the pressure from the USA on trade with Russia or Ukraine. Otherwise, European Union was quite happily going along, trading with Russia both for gas and for oil, for energy. So it's very surprising, but it's a reaction to what the USA is doing. Number one. Number two, for the European Union to do when we are negotiating the FTA with them is again a huge surprise. You don't get into this kind of action when you're negotiating the FTA unless you want to jeopardize that FTA. Number three, China versus India. Very surprisingly, as far as oil is concerned, and where Europe and China have a stake is in the oil prices. And the sanctions basically reduce the oil prices by 15%. They do not impact on the refining capacity of the country. So are they trying to basically now privilege China over India? Are they going to really say that China is a preferred partner over India in terms of the geopolitics? If that is the case, then India will have to really think of its options, both in terms of the double standards and in terms of the diversity of its own supply. And lastly, Uday, as I said before, I don't think the global trade has ever been impacted by sanctions regime like this. Take the example of Iran, take the example of Vietnam, take the example of China. Any example you take, the trade has its own natural flow. It is going to flow the way where the demands are, where the supply is, where the markets are. So I don't think we need to bother about that. But what we need to bother about is which way is the geopolitics going, both American and European. Uday.
Let me leave it at that. My thanks to all of our guests for joining us. We've run totally out of time. Let's step into a short break.